In this lecture, you are going to learn about the early civil rights movement, Emmett Till, Brown versus the Board of Education, the Little Rock Nine, and the Montgomery bus boycotts. When will you start the timeline for the civil rights in America? Well, although many historians argue that the battle for equality has been one that people have been fighting since the founding of our nation, others trace it back to the Reconstruction period, and others to the early 20th century. Few can dispute that it has been a long journey that will culminate in the 1950s and 1960s. We can argue that both World War I and World War II mobilized African Americans. Both wars created a mass migration out of the segregated South to escape death and lynching. This prompts a new awakening for African Americans, especially those living in urban centers. With the Harlem Renaissance reaffirming Black identity and organizations like the NUIA, United Negro Improvement Association, and the NAACP becoming the preeminent political organization fighting for civil rights of blacks. The NAACP in particular will take a legal approach, working to bring down Plessy versus Ferguson. In part because of the NAACP and the UNIA, we will see a series of cases brought to the Supreme Court. In the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, that will be slowly chipping away at separate but equal, but not really getting there. Then in 1941, we will see the first signs of a movement. Philip Randolph, a black activist, does not think legal tactics are making enough progress, and he wants a mass movement approach. Because of this movement, the Double B campaign will be launched, and it will result in the Fair Employment Practices Act and the Fair Employment Practices Commission to mandate integration in jobs. As mentioned before, these efforts will have mixed results. Moreover, after the war, returning veterans come back emboldened, having honorably served our country and coming back home to a segregated society, resulted in further organization who wanted change. In the post-war years, we will see the creation of CORE, or Congress of Racial Equality in the South. Then during the Korean War, Truman finally desegregates the armed forces. We also began to see other positive signs, like popular culture slowly breaking down the color bar. In 1947, Jack Robinson joined the Brooklyn Dodgers to become the first African American to play in major leagues. However, despite these great achievements, persistent discrimination continues. The United States in the 1950s was still very much segregated. Half of the nation's black families lived in poverty. Moreover, in the post-war years, we will see losses in industrial jobs by black families as soldiers come back home. In the North, the law did not require segregation, but custom barred blacks from many colleges, hotels, and restaurants, and for most suburban housing. Jim Crow in the South and terrorism continued. One clear example is the murder of Emmett Till. In the summer of 1955, two white men in Mississippi kidnapped and brutally murdered 14-year-old Emmett Till. Till, visiting from Chicago and perhaps unfamiliar with the etiquette of Jim Crow, allegedly whistled at a white woman named Carolyn Bryant. Her husband, Roy Bryant, and another man, J.W. Millen, abducted Till from his relative's home, beat him, mutilated him, shot him, and threw his body in the Tallahatchie River. Emmett's mother held an open casket funeral so that Till's disfigured body could make national news. The men were brought to trial. The evidence was damning, but an all-white jury found the two not guilty. Mere months after the decision, the two boasted of their crime in all of its brutal detail in Lock magazine. "They ain't gonna go to school with my kids," Millen said. They wanted to make an example of Till, just so everyone can know how me and my folks stand. The Till case became a permanent memory for the young black men and women soon to propel the civil rights movement forward. Thus, we will see in the 1950s the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. The early modern civil rights movement from 1955 to 1964 will concentrate on pushing integration into mainstream American life and to end Jim Crow in the South. It will also focus on voter registration, and it will occur primarily in the South. One of the most influential civil rights legislations of the time period will be the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court ruling. Remember, as just one lawsuit, Brown v. Board of Education consolidated 5 separate cases that had originated in the southeastern United States. Briggs v. Elliott from South Carolina, Davis v. County School Board of Prince Edward County from Virginia, Balua v. Belton, Delaware, Moyling v. Sharp from Washington, D.C., and Brown v. the Board of Education from Kansas. Working with local activists already involved in the segregation fights, the NAACP purposely showed cases with a diverse set of local backgrounds to show that segregation was not just an issue in the Deep South, and that a sweeping judgment on the fundamental constitutionality of Percy was needed. Briggs v. Elliott, the first case accepted by the NAACP, illustrated the plight of segregated black schools. Briggs originated in rural Clarendon County, South Carolina, where taxpayers in 1950 spent $179 to educate each white student and $43 for each black student. The district's 12 white schools were worth $673,000, The value of its 61 black schools, mostly dilapidated, overcrowded shacks, was $194,000. On the Brown versus the Board of Education case, parents of Linda Brown, supported by the NAACP, sued the school district to get her daughter admitted to an all-white school. Linda Brown had to cross a dangerous railroad track to attend an all-black school. While the Briggs case underscored the South's failure to follow Plessy, the Brown suit focused less on material disparities between black and white schools and more on the social and spiritual degradation that accompanied legal segregation. This case cut to the basic question of whether separate was itself inherently unequal. The NAACP said the two notions were incompatible. As one witness before the U.S. District Court of Kansas said, the entire color race is craving light, and the only way to reach that light is to start black and white children together in their infancy, and they come up together. To make its case, the NAACP pointed out historical and social scientific evidence. The court found the historical evidence inconclusive and drew their ruling more heavily from the NAACP's argument that segregation psychologically damaged black children. To make this argument, association lawyers rely on social scientific evidence, such as the famous doll experiments from Kenneth and Mamie Clark. The Clarks demonstrated that while young white girls who naturally chose to play with white dolls, young black girls will do too. The Clarks argued that black children's aesthetic and moral preference for white dolls demonstrated the precarious effects and self-loathing produced by segregation. The Brown versus the Board of Education case ruling overturned the separate but equal precedent established in Percy versus Ferguson in 1896. The court declared that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal and thus violated the 14th Amendment. Though Brown repeated Percy, the court's orders do not extend to segregation in places other than public schools, and even then, to preserve a unanimous decision for such a historically important case, the justices set aside the divisive yet essential question of enforcement. Their famously ambiguous order in 1955, what came to be known as Brown No. 2, that school districts desegregate with an odd deliberate speed, was so vague and ineffectual that it left the actual business of desegregation in the hands of those who opposed it. In most of the South, as well as the rest of the country, school integration did not occur on a wide scale until well after Brown. Only in the 1964 Civil Rights Act did the federal government finally implement some enforcement of the Brown decision by threatening to withhold funds from school districts, but even then, certain districts found loopholes. As a landmark movement in American history, Brown's significance perhaps lied less in immediate tangible changes, which were slow, partial, and inseparable from a much longer chain of events, than in the idealism it expressed and the momentum it created. In Brown, the nation's highest court had attacked on the fundamental support of Jim Crow segregation and offered constitutional cover for the creation of one of the greatest social movements in American history. Part of the reason why the segregation of public schools took such a long time was because of the deep opposition by Southern segregationists. In 1956, 82 of 106 Southern congressmen and every Southern senator, except Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas and Al Gore and Esther Kiefer of Tennessee, signed the Southern Manifesto, denouncing Brown and calling for resistance to forced integration by any lawful means. Then, during the summer of 1957, 9 African-American students, later known as the Little Rock Nine, enrolled at Little Rock Central High School, which until then had been all white. Warned by the Little Rock Board of Education not to attend the first day of school, the 9 African-American students arrived on the second day, accompanied by a small interracial group of ministers. They encountered a large white mob in front of the school who began shouting, throwing stones, and threatening to kill the students. In addition, about 270 soldiers of the Arkansas National Guard were sent by Arkansas Governor Orville Eugene Favas to block the school's entrance to the Little Rock Nine. Favas had declared his opposition to integration and his intention to defy a federal court order requiring desegregation. The confrontation in Little Rock drew international attention to racism and civil rights in the United States, as well as to the battle between federal and state power. President Eisenhower then called Governor Favas and Little Rock's mayor, Woodrow Mann, to discuss the situation over the course of 18 days, during which time the 9 students stayed home. Eventually, Eisenhower prevailed, and the students were allowed into the school. However, when they tried to return, the protesters became violent, attacking African American bystanders as well as reporters from Northern newspapers. Despite Eisenhower's publicly stated reluctance to use federal troops to enforce desegregation, he recognized the potential for violence. So, Eisenhower would send the elite 101st Airborne Division, called the Screaming Eagles, to Little Rock and place the Arkansas National Guard under federal command. Then, on September 25th, the students returned protected by U.S. soldiers. The Little Rock Nine continued to face physical and verbal attacks from white students throughout their studies at Central High. One of the students, Minnie Jim Brown, fought back and was expelled. The remaining 8 students, however, attended the school for the rest of the academic year. At the end of the year, in 1958, senior Ernest Green became the first African American to graduate from Little Rock Central High School. Governor Phoebus was re-elected in 1958, and rather than permit desegregation, he closed all of Little Rock's schools. Many school districts in the South followed Little Rock's example, closing schools or implementing school choice programs that subsidized white students' attendance at private segregated academies, which were not covered by the Supreme Court's decision. Little Rock Central High School did not reopen with the desegregated student body until 1960. 2 years after the Little Rock Nine, a federal court ordered Louisiana to desegregate. The school district created entrance exams for African American students to see whether they could compete academically at an all-white school. 6-year-old Ruby Bridge and 5 other students passed the exam. Her parents were torn about whether to let her attend the all-white William Friends Elementary School a few blocks from their home. Her father initially resisted, fearing for her daughter's safety. Her mother, however, wanted Ruby to have the educational opportunities that her parents had been denied. Meanwhile, the school district dragged its feet, delaying her admittance until November 14. 2 of the other students decided not to leave their school at all. The other 3 were sent to the all-white McDonald Elementary School. Just as with the Little Rock Nine, Ruby was met by a crowd of angry protesters the first day she attended school. She spent her first day in the principal's office due to the chaos created as angry white parents pulled their children from school. Ardent segregationists withdrew their children permanently. Barbara Henry, a white Boston native, was the only teacher willing to accept Ruby, and during the whole year, she was a class of 1. For her safety, 6-year-old Ruby and her mother were escorted by 4 federal marshals to the school every day that year to protect them. She walked past crowds screaming vicious slurs at her. Undeterred, she later said she only became frightened when she saw a woman holding a black baby doll in a coffin. During the school year, Ruby ate lunch alone and sometimes played with her teacher at recess, but she never missed a day of school that year. The Bridge family suffered for their courage. Her father lost his job, and grocery stores refused to sell to her mother. Her sharecropping grandparents were evicted from the farm where they had lived for a quarter century. But nevertheless, they resisted. In 1964, artist Norma Rockwell celebrated her courage with a painting of the first day entitled "The Problem We All Live With." Looking back at the experience, Ruby said later as a young woman, "Racism is something that we as adults have kept alive. We pass it on to our kids. None of our kids come into this world knowing anything about disliking one another." Efforts to integrate schools and other public areas throughout the country continued throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. As the civil rights movement garnered more followers and more attention, white resistance stiffened. In October 1962, James Merritt became the first African American student to enroll at the University of Mississippi. Meredith's enrollment sparked riots on the Oxford campus, prompting President John F. Kennedy to send in U.S. Marshals and National Guardsmen to maintain order. On an evening known infamously as the Battle of Ole Miss, segregationists clashed with troops in the middle of campus, resulting in 2 deaths and hundreds of injuries. Violence served as a reminder of the strength of white resistance to the civil rights movement, particularly in the realm of education. As the movement took shape, black activists began to fight to end segregation in other public spaces. On December 1st, 1955, 4 months after Dale's murder, Rosa Parks, 43 at the time, was arrested for disorderly conduct for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white passenger. Montgomery's public transportation system had long-standing rules requiring African American passengers to sit in the back of the bus and to give up their seats to white passengers if the buses were filled. There is a myth that Parks was simply tired and thus sat in the white section, but she was a prominent activist in the black community, and she probably planned it and was not a matter of convenience, but a political protest. Parks was not the first to protest the policy by staying seated, but she was the first to whom Montgomery activists rallied for. Her arrest and the $14 fine for violating the city ordinance led African American bus riders and others to boycott the Montgomery city buses. Montgomery's black population, under the leadership of local ministers and civil rights workers, formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, and coordinated and organized a boycott of the city buses. This was especially effective since African Americans made up 60 to 70% of the total ridership. For 381 days, despite legal harassment and occasional violence, black maids, janitors, teachers, and students walked to their destination or rode in an informal network of taxis. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted from December 1955 until December of 1956, when the Supreme Court ordered their integration. The boycott not only crushed segregation in Montgomery's public transportation, it energized the entire civil rights movement and established the leadership of MIA's president, a recently arrived 26-year-old Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr. Inspired by his faith in Jesus and Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. promoted a nonviolence resistance to segregation and racism. Motivated by the success of the Montgomery boycott, King and other African American leaders continued the fight. In 1957, King helped create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, to coordinate civil rights groups across the South and maintain their efforts to organizing and sustaining boycotts, protests, and other assaults against Southern Jim Crow laws. As pressure built, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first such measure passed since Reconstruction. The act was compromised away nearly to nothing, although it did achieve some gains, such as creating the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Commission, which was charged with investigating claims of racial discrimination. And yet, despite its weakness, the act signaled the pressure was finally mounting on Americans to confront the legacy of discrimination. Despite successes at both the local and national level, the civil rights movement faced bitter opposition. Those opposed to the movement often used violent tactics to scare and intimidate African Americans and subvert legal rulings and court orders. For example, a year into the Montgomery bus boycott, angry white Southerners bombed 4 African American churches as well as the homes of King and fellow civil rights leader E.D. Nixon. Though King, Nixon, and MIA persevered in the face of such violence, it was only a taste of things to come. Such hostility and violence left the outcome of the foregoing civil rights movement in doubt. Despite its success, civil rights activists look back on the 1950s as a decade of mixed results and incomplete accomplishments. While the bus boycott, Supreme Court rulings, and other civil rights activities signaled progress, church bombings, death threats, and stubborn legislators demonstrated the distance that still needed to be traveled. That is all for now. To learn more, please watch the next video lecture.